This is day 10 of the novel challenge, and today we are talking about making a scene list. So, at this point, you have done a lot of work making this novel matrix plan, and you're identifying your conflicts and your plot structure and your primary and secondary characters and elements of your universe that are going to be important to the story. And hopefully, that's all going really well for you. So, you don't yet need to be done with that. So, continue to plug away at that today, filling in those holes, getting things rearranged until everything fits just right. So if you're unsure of some element of your plan, the best thing that you can do is look elsewhere on your plan and see if something can inspire that element. So, for instance, if you're unsure what the driving conflict is, well, go ahead and look to the impossible thing and see which conflict you're considering most closely correlates to that impossible thing that you've identified. And the opposite works as well. You may have a really good idea for the conflict that you want to develop for your protagonist, but you don't yet know what the impossible thing is. Well, you can work backwards. Start with the conflict and then ask your question, what element of the plot, what element of the story would really manifest this conflict and draw it out into the open? So, for instance, if I was writing Star Wars and I knew that I had this great idea for the character Luke Skywalker, and I had this really fantastic idea for this bad guy named Darth Vader, who is part robot and dresses all in black. And I knew that. So I knew that my external conflict is Luke versus Darth Vader. Then I'd ask the question, what can I put these guys in contest for? Is there something that they would both want that I could place and they'd have to compete for it? Or is there something that they would have mutually exclusive goals for, that they want opposite things for? And now that gives me some specific questions to ask so that I can continue to develop the plan and fill in those holes. But as that plan comes together, you might have noticed that on the 3-act structure, we only have a few things identified, right? We've got the save the cat moment, the old college try, the rock bottom moment, the Icarus moment, and so on. But that's not enough to write a novel about. So we need to further break down that plot structure into individual scenes. So, the content for today's topic comes from chapter 16 of the Novel Matrix book. As always, I encourage you to check that out and go deeper there. So, we're going to take the elements of your plot and break it down into individual scenes. So, really good question would be, what is a scene? Well, a scene is a complete unit of story. And what we typically mean by a scene is that it's an unbroken series of action that happens in a particular time and place. There can be a lot of exceptions to that. You could have a creative scene in which you're juxtaposing, characters in this location, and then we're flashing over to characters in this other location. And that's still a scene, but there's going to be something that unifies those elements together that makes it a unit of story that works together. So you're going to take your plot structure and develop that into specific units of story. In this scene, these elements take place. In this scene, these characters are developed in this way, etc., etc. Now, common question that I get is, how many scenes do I need for a book-length work? And that's such a great question. I wish I could give you a really simple answer to it. However, it's going to depend greatly on who you are as a writer and your natural narrative voice. So, scenes that are 1,000 words or less are going to feel really quick and snappy. Scenes that are 2,500 words or longer are going to feel really deep and possibly compelling if they're well written. So a lot of the scene length is a genre consideration as well. Genres like adventure and thrillers and mystery tend to have shorter scenes because it gives the story a sense of velocity. You feel like you're just plugging away through the story. These are the kind of stories that you're like reading before bed and you tell yourself, oh, just one more chapter. And then you read one more chapter and, oh, just one more chapter, right? Because it has these little small segments. It doesn't feel like a big investment. And then before you know it, though, it's like 2 a.m. Whereas genres like literary fiction tend to have long scenes because oftentimes we want to kind of submerge the reader in these beautiful prose and really, really get them immersed in the scene. So you have to consider the genre, but also your natural narrative voice. When you write other things, how long of content do you usually write? Do you usually write fast and snappy things, or do you really like to take deep dives and meander through the topic? That'll all determine how long of scenes you should write. However, if you're like, I have no idea, Brad, this is the first thing I've ever written, a good place to start with would be considering or predicting that you'll write about 1,500 word scenes. So 1,500 words are right in the middle. They're not super fast and snappy, but they're not long, deep dives either. So, inexperienced writers or people that are still kind of finding their voice, that tends to be a sweet spot where you might land. And if you're at 1,500 word scenes, then reasonably you're going to need about 40 scenes to complete a novel length work. So you could think of that as like 12 to 15 scenes per act. So to get the protagonist from that save the cat moment to the rock bottom moment, you've got about 12 scenes to make all that happen. And then from the rock bottom moment up to the Icarus moment, which is the halfway point of the second act, you've got about 6 or so scenes to make that happen. But it's going to be heavily dependent again on your voice as a writer, and the scenes don't all have to be equal in length. Oftentimes, it is helpful to have a rhythm to the story where scenes are somewhat of the same size, but it's definitely possible, especially if you want to achieve a particular emotional effect, to use your scene length to your advantage. So if you're writing snappy scenes, but now you really want to hold the reader in a particular emotion, then extend out the next scene, right? Make it much longer than usual. Or if you typically write long scenes, but you want to surprise the reader, you just want to dump something on them, or there's an accident in the book, and you want to really help the reader to feel that sense of suddenness, then you've been writing 2,500 scenes and knock that out in 500 words, and you will surprise the reader. They will take note of that. So there are a few things that every scene should do. And this is really important. This might be one of the most important things that you can pick up from these lessons in the first 2 weeks of the novel challenge. So there are 3 purposes that every scene should serve. Every scene should motivate plot, develop character, and develop themes. And these are so important that if a scene doesn't do at least 2 of those things, cut it from the book. Just don't include it. Continue to brainstorm and think about a different scene that would satisfy at least 2 of these elements. So let me go through them a little more slowly. So first, every scene should motivate the plot. Every scene should have elements that draw us closer to the resolution of the story. Scenes that either raise the stakes or intentionally release the stakes, but in which something changes related to the character's journey through this story. Every scene should develop character, which all that means is that we should learn about the characters on the page through the scene. And if you're doing a good job of bringing those characters to the page and allowing your reader to see them and spend time with them, that's naturally going to happen. So the big thing there is just to make sure that your characters are present on the scene, that you are maintaining your whole character list, and not some of them aren't disappearing for half the book and then suddenly reappearing again. And then when they're on the scene, make sure that you're giving them time to talk. Make sure that you're giving them adequate description and things like that. And thirdly, every scene should develop themes. Now, this is both the easiest and the hardest one to do. If you know what your themes are, and that's something that you've thought about and considered, then all you need to do is make sure that you're using your writing and your descriptions to use adjectives and synonyms that draw out the deeper meaning of the story. However, if that's a new concept to you, all I mean by develop themes, I'm asking the question, what's the point of your story? Sure, you seem to be writing about this one thing, but what's the story really about? Is it really about loneliness or betrayal or true love or light versus dark? So begin to think in those terms. And then once you know what your themes are, as long as you're cognizant of that and you're able to keep track of it as you write, it becomes relatively simple to make sure that you're pulling in the right vocabulary so that you're consistently reinforcing the same ideas through the narrative. So again, those are the 3 things that every scene needs to do. It needs to motivate plot, it needs to develop character, and it needs to develop themes. I have a helpful resource for you in this regard. It's the Novel Matrix Scene Plan. You can download it for free at novelmatrix.com/scene plan. And once again, this correlates really closely to the content in chapter 16 of the Novel Matrix book. But that scene plan is going to ask you some really simple questions. So it's going to lead you through the process to make sure that you are maintaining the proper elements through each scene. So right at the top, it's going to ask you to give a title to the scene.
This is just for your benefit. So call it something that makes sense to you. Maddie fights with Steve. John accidentally hits a drug dealer with his car. Whatever is just going to quickly bring things to your memory. Then after that, it asks you for the act and the scene number. Again, those are just helpful for you. So it's not a test or anything like that. Just make some notations there that help you to remember where this scene goes in the sequence, and you can always move it around later. That's no big deal. Then we ask for the scene description. This is your opportunity to just provide a few details so that when you go to write this scene, you don't have to sit down and really think about or try to remember what you meant by that scene title. So this isn't elaborate. You don't have to spend 20 minutes on this, but just in 60 seconds, what are a few details that you want to include in this scene that are going to jog your memory so that when it comes time to write this, you can jump right in. And then the next series of questions really touches on those three things that we just considered. First, it asks you the purpose of the scene. Like, what are you trying to show in this scene? Then it asks you the plot points developed. So again, this relates to motivating the plot. How does this scene draw your protagonist through the story that you're trying to tell? What important thing happens here? Conflict serviced. Every element of your plan needs to end up in the scene. So even though you have one driving conflict that your reader is really going to attach to, we have 5 on purpose, and so they each need to show up throughout the story. Which ones are you including in this particular scene? Characters developed. Same exact story. Not every character is going to show up in every scene, but which ones are you going to give special attention to here? And these questions are also important because if you have several scenes in a row in which a particular character doesn't appear, that should be a warning to you like, hey, I need to bring that character back onto the stage because I have to maintain them through the entire story. Stakes raised. And this is shorthand. It could also be stakes relieved, but every scene should either raise or relieve the stakes, as in the situation should become more dire and more serious with every single scene. Subplots developed. We haven't had time to touch on subplots in this novel challenge, but that's another area that you can really get more information on in the book or in the classes on the company's website, and that's going to be helpful for you. Theme or voice. So, how are you going to tell this story? Is there anything in particular that you want to mention or words that you want to use that continue to reinforce those themes that you've been developing throughout the book? And then finally, and this is a really important question, what changes in this scene? So, every story should, every scene should change something about the story. If a scene doesn't change anything about the story, then why are you telling it? It's really not useful to the story. So that's the scene plan. That's going to walk you through this process to make sure that you are, consistently developing your scenes so that they are useful to your novel manuscript. You might not have an answer to every question on the scene plan for every single scene, and that's okay usually. However, just like I mentioned with the characters, if you're consistently not answering a question, or if like several scenes in a row you aren't able to answer a particular question, then you really need to go back to your plan and ask the question, what am I not including here? What isn't making it into the scene plan? And one of the most important things about your scene list is that all the elements of your novel matrix worksheets need to make it into that scene list. So you have 7 characters and you have 5 conflicts, and each one of those needs to be maintained throughout the entire narrative. So again, even though you have one driving conflict that is going to be prominent and it's going to get more airtime, so to speak, than any of the other conflicts, we still need to be touching on all of them. So after you've created those scene lists, that scene list, and you have some scenes in order, you should compare that to your novel matrix plan and just take one element at a time. Look, for instance, at your little world internal conflict and ask yourself, which scenes here address the little world internal conflict? That just touch on it. It doesn't have to be all about it, but it at least mentions it or draws in a factor or manifests that conflict in some way. And if as you're going through the scene list, it's hard to find some, or you find that there's a big gap, like you mention it early in the first act, but then you really don't touch on the little world internal conflict until right before the Icarus moment, well, you've got a problem there. And so now you need to invent some scenes that service the internal conflict between there, or think about the existing scenes that you have and tag that element on. It's this exact same idea with your characters. So your characters won't be introduced until they're introduced, right? So for instance, your frenemy might not be introduced until after the rock bottom moment. That wouldn't be unreasonable. So obviously, he's not going to appear then in the first act. But after the frenemy is introduced, now you have a duty to maintain that character through the rest of the narrative. So, just like we did with your conflicts, you could take a pencil and kind of walk through your scene list and just make a check mark next to the scenes in which your frenemy appears, in which he's developed in some way or is allowed to do a job of some sort. And if you find that there's a big gap, then you need to ask the question, well, do I need to insert more scenes, or is there a scene between these 2 points that I could also include my frenemy? And as you walk through your plan and your scene list, you do that with every single element. And when all of the elements are appropriately represented in scenes, then you're in really good shape to start moving forward with the writing. Now, I do want to make one special note, and that's that all of the elements should be represented in scenes, but they aren't all represented equally. So, of course, your driving conflict is going to get more attention. It's going to be serviced in more scenes than any of the other four conflicts. But even among the other four, some of them are going to get more attention than others. The biggest thing you want to look for is consistency. That you don't have a big grouping of attention on an element in one area of the story and then it just disappears absentmindedly until later in the story. Same thing is true with your characters. Of course, some characters are going to have bigger roles than others, even though we call them all secondary characters. And so, as you're looking at those characters, it's okay if your sidekick shows up a lot more than your object of affection. In fact, that would be really, really normal. But the important thing is there a consistent distribution of attention that's given to each of those characters so that you're effectively maintaining them through the story? Your assignment today is to begin to create your scene list. So if you're not done yet with the novel matrix plan, you still have elements to figure out, that's fine. Keep working on that. Now, it would be reasonable, even if you still have a few holes, you can start creating some individual scene plans. And in fact, that might even be helpful to get your wheels turning and thinking creatively and more specifically about the story. And that might help you to fill in some of the missing gaps from your novel matrix plan. So if that's helpful, feel free to jump over. But effectively, you're going to complete the novel matrix plan first, and then you're going to move into this scene list. Now, as I've said before, your scene list isn't rigid. We're not trying to create a coffin for the story where it's like you're just painting by number, and each time you sit down to write, you just fill in this itty bitty gap between two things and there's no creativity. That's not what we're doing at all. Your scene plans can be very general, and that allows you the creativity that you can sit down, you can be inspired, you can still figure out how whatever happens in the scene happens. So you are going to identify a purpose, you're going to identify what changes in your scene plan, but how that happens is still completely up to you. And that allows you to still have a lot of fun when you sit down. So this isn't a coffin for your story, it's a skeleton. It's just it's a tool that's going to help you sit down and use your time effectively day after day after day as you run this marathon of writing a novel. So today, finish the novel matrix plan, start filling out the scene list, and have fun with it. Utilize those resources at novelmatrix.com. Those are there for your benefit because I want to see you write a great story. So have fun with that. Happy writing and be blessed.